Well, good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to see you all again. A very, very warm, she says, looking out the
Very
window
warm.
on the Slough trading estate. A very warm Wednesday. And we're here again as part of our CityFibre Digital Academy. And delighted to be back with Craig from OneFix, who is sharing his knowledge with us once again. And today
Wonderful.
we're going to be talking about how to know if you should be using a file sharing system such as SharePoint. So Craig, who is the managing director at one of our lovely members, who is OneFix Limited, is here once again to share. So I'm going to pass you over, and you're in his capable hands. We will do a Q&A at the end, but the Q&A and message boxes are open if anyone's got any Q&A that for any questions that Craig may not have answered during his presentation, we can take those at the end. So, Craig, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate that. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to be invited back to do another CityFibre and Chamber of Commerce webinar. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm going to just share my screen. So bear with me just a second. Make sure I share the correct one. Here we go. Right, there we go. Okay, so today's topic, we're going to cover off how do you know basically if you should be using a file sharing system such as SharePoint. I have to make a confession. Obviously, corporately and at OneFix, we are very much Microsoft partners. So SharePoint is the system I know the best. I do know a bit about other file sharing systems, and I'm happy to answer questions. I've tried to keep this presentation fairly generic, but at certain points, so it is going to kind of reference back into SharePoint because unfortunately, we do kind of cover things that we know. So to get started, the first thing is just talking about file sharing and systems. So why are we interested in this in the first place? Well, the key thing I think is that there's lots of businesses will be doing different things with files. Now, there's many people, many of you probably may already be using cloud file sharing. I'd be surprised if you weren't using it in some way, shape, or form. But really, the purpose behind having file sharing and why we want to think about this really is around how we store and manage things and how we collaborate. So, if you consider if you're a corporate where you may have files and folders and things stored on a server in the office, and there are still some around. We still have some clients where they do have physical servers and they have that kit in the office. Some of the challenges around that can be, again, how do you collaborate on that data? How do you access it remotely? How do you make sure that you can make that available for who you want to be able to make it available to, and how do you make it modern and be able to work and move around with you? So what we're going to talk about today is some of these different cloud systems and how you can utilize those to basically help you to be more productive with the data that you've got. So as I said, I'm going to touch on SharePoint on this one because this is the product that I know. But SharePoint is essentially comes with your Microsoft 365. So if you are a Microsoft partner, you get this. If you're a Google house and you're on, say, Google Workspace, you will get something called Google Drive. And again, broadly similar, Google Drive is a file sharing platform, so you can kind of substitute some of this stuff for Google Drive. But essentially, what does SharePoint let you do? So SharePoint lets you share files, and the key thing with SharePoint, actually, and this is the real selling point, is if you are, again, on the Microsoft ecosystem, so if you're in something like Word or Excel or PowerPoint, SharePoint facilitates the ability for you to be able to share and collaborate in documents in real time. Now, that might not mean anything to you if you haven't tried to do this before, but for those of you that have, you'll understand the power. What it essentially means is, for example, if I have a Word document I'm authoring, I could share that with a colleague of mine. They can review it in real time as I'm typing, and as I'm typing, they'll see what I'm typing appear in the document. I can see where they are. It puts a little kind of cursor there to show me who's clicked where and what they're doing. And if they were to edit the document, we can kind of co-author it. So we can both be working on it, and they can be in a different office, a different location. Same with Excel, same with PowerPoint. You have this ability of co-authoring and collaboration. One of the key things with SharePoint that kind of differs slightly from something like Google Drive or Dropbox is you have what they call document libraries. So most people, and I'm as guilty of this as most other people, most of us are using SharePoint probably not in the original way it was intended. Most of us are now using SharePoint as just as a pure file storage solution, and actually SharePoint does a bit more than that. So SharePoint, its background is kind of around document management originally. So like being able to put documents into a repository, check them out so other people can't edit them, make changes, put them back in again, organizing big amounts of documents, you can add things like metadata to documents and create ways to view them. And SharePoint is web-based as well, so you can view it through the web. So for those people that are kind of gone deep with SharePoint, and this tends to be a bit more on the enterprise side, but uh, SharePoint can be used to say create an internal intranet, lots of documents, and you can kind of surface different documents based on the data that you've tagged them with. So for example, you can have documents living in all sorts of places and tag them up with a piece of metadata that says that they are an HR document, for example, and then you could surface them to the front of the HR page. So you can do some pretty cool stuff with it, or you can just use it as a file storage library and you can just store things and synchronize them. You can use it two ways. So SharePoint integrates really well with Microsoft Office. Again, if you're on Google and you Google Drive and using Google Sheets and all that kind of stuff, then Drive does a very similar thing, and Sheets will let you kind of do that co-authoring. So some of these things do cross over with other file sharing platforms. If you're storing your data in something like Dropbox or Box or one of the many other file cloud services, unless they've paid quite a high price to integrate with Microsoft at a kind of a deep level, you don't get that same collaboration functionality. So that is one of the kind of the benefits you get here with SharePoint and Google Drive if you're on Google. And then team collaboration. So being able to actually kind of create sites and areas that people can collaborate on documents. So again, keeping in the Microsoft ecosystem for a second, and apologies for those of you that aren't on that platform, but things like Microsoft Teams, if you've used Teams before, again, you'll know that there's ways that you can store documents. You can have libraries of documents within Teams and little tabs along the top. All of that in the background is powered by SharePoint. So this is all kind of cool core things about this kind of file sharing platform that's key. But in general, when we're talking about general file sharing and file collaboration, what are the benefits there of actually using these kind of systems? So we talked about real-time collaboration. That was the key. We've talked about that part already, but actually version control. So one of the challenges you have traditionally, if you have just your files sitting on a server in the office, and lots of people have got access to them and they can make changes, unless you've got a fairly robust backup strategy, it's quite easy for the files to get tweaks and changed, deleted, overwritten, adjusted, and you can't go back to the original. Hopefully if you have got files in the office, you have got a data backup. That gives you an opportunity to go back and kind of pull files from the backup and restore them. But you're certainly only going to capture what was there at the point you took the backup. So let's say, for example, like most companies are probably backing up either once a day or at best maybe once every 4 hours. So if there's been huge amounts of changes to the document in between that time that the backup was last taken and then the changes, you're going to lose all of those changes. Using SharePoint, OneDrive, these kind of tools, you actually get a storage of every single revision of the document, up to about 100. So essentially, every time you make changes and you tweak things, another revision is stored. You can roll back. So it's really useful again in something like Microsoft Office that you can take a document you've been working on. You can go, oh, do you know what? I think I might have made some changes last month. You can, you can pull up the revisions. You can kind of open up one of the prior revisions and compare the two documents. That's really useful. And that's part and parcel of kind of having a more of a cloud-based file sharing platform. And then the ability to streamline your workflow. So actually to be able to more efficiently just get access to that data, to pass it to people, to share it to external people. Again, when you've got files that sit on a server in the office, to give external companies access to that data, for example, if you want to share, I don't know, accounts data with an accounts company, that's a bit of a challenge if it's just sitting on a server because you have to probably get them. You've got to speak to IT. You've probably got to get them some sort of VPN access. It's just getting technical. You've got to create ways for them to get in. If you have your data stored in the cloud, it's much easier. You can create sharing links and pass that data off to people. Tapping alongside that, I say certainly from a SharePoint perspective, also from Google Drive and some of the other platforms, you've got much more enhanced document management and security functionality around your files versus traditionally having them in an office. So we touched on the metadata side and tagging those documents, but you've got really quite granular permission control. So actually understanding creating caps, for example, when we create SharePoint libraries, we bundle them up by different teams. So we would say, for example, HR might have this one, management will have this one. Different people can have different access to different areas of data and documents. But also really importantly, and you do get this tool on a file server to an extent, but it's harder to pull through, is the audit logging. So the actual capability to understand who's accessing documents, who's moving documents around. Audit logging becomes even more crucial once this stuff's in the cloud, because actually understanding, well, who's got access to it, who have I shared that with? Potentially, I might have a folder on my machine that I've shared with a third party. I actually need to know that that third party still has access, because if I start to put other documents in there, I may start to leak data. So there are concerns there, and that, having those kind of audit logs really helps with that, and having that control around that documentation and data. So the right access and flexibility. So being able to, using a modern file sharing system, so I say such as SharePoint, but also if you are using something like Dropbox or Box or any of those other products, having that access to the data from everywhere. We've talked about that before, but that's really key. Being able to do that, being able to work flexibly remotely. We saw a huge shift in terms of people looking at how quickly they could get their data out of their corporate environments into the cloud around 2020, around COVID, because obviously that was a huge push for remote work. But there are still buckets of data sitting around in companies, either on servers or on what's called a NAS box, like a network storage box. And again, these kind of islands of data are core kind of corporate assets. So working out how you can get them up into the cloud and make them flexible is a real key thing. And the productivity boost. I mean, having that data available. I mean, prime example for myself. I was in the office yesterday on my laptop working on some documentation for a meeting today. I've come home on my PC. I've opened it up. Word has that document there as my most recently accessed document. I can open it up. I'm straight back in where I was. So I've moved location and device, and I'm still able to pick up my work and carry straight on. So this is the kind of the key thing about the global term for this stuff is really modern work. Modern work is that ability to flex around locations and devices, and the data is just available for you where you need it. So it's a real key from a productivity drive point of view, especially if you have teams that are hybrid. Certainly, it's a huge benefit. So one of the key things really is having to think about how you identify the right fit and the right type of tool for your company. Because as I say, this isn't necessarily SharePoint might not be the right option. There's lots of platforms on the market. So it's really key to kind of think about how best to pick the right platform, what fits best for you. So one of the first things I would suggest when you're undertaking a project like this and you're thinking about it, well, actually, do you know what? The first thing I'll suggest is actually speak to your IT team, because they're going to have the best idea. If you are the IT team on this call, then here's some of the things you might want to think about. And if you don't have an IT team, hello, you can reach out to us. That's fine. I'd love to speak to you. But in all seriousness, the first things to look at, assessing your company's size and structure. So the reason why it's really kind of important to understand this is because all of these different file sharing platforms have some level of limitation. Now, it might be that they have a data size limitation. You might only be able to store a certain amount of data on these platforms. Alternatively, there may be technical complexities with the products as to how many files you can have in a folder, for example. So without getting into the technical weeds, because I'm going to want to keep this very high level, I'm going to give you a prime example that SharePoint, as an example, has challenges around synchronizing to people's computers if you have more than 300,000 files or folders, which sounds absolutely huge. But then when you start to look at some corporate file servers and the amount of archive data and old stuff and folders within folders, you can quite easily hit that 300,000 limit. I mean, it sounds huge, but it's not. So there needs to be some thought process around, is it the right tool? Do we need everything on the cloud? So looking at kind of, say, size and scalability, what you need, how big the organization is now, how big you expect the organization might grow, maybe in the next 3 to 5 years, is a really good thing to think about. Actually, I haven't put it here as a bullet point, but geographic thinking is also really useful, because if you have, for example, a team of people that maybe you have a team in the UK, a team in India, a team in China, as an example, how do you make sure that whatever platform you're choosing facilitates reasonable, fast access for all of those different locations, maybe still allows them to collaborate in real time, maybe ensures that they are storing their data within the right areas for data governance. And then, yeah, thinking about the kind of departmental collaboration needs, because again, collaboration is great, but I'm very unlikely to need to collaborate on a document with, for example, I don't know, HR. So do I need to be involved in that? So kind of starting to map out the structure, thinking about who you've got in the organization, who talks to who maps out where would you store data. I think one of the key mistakes people make when they're thinking about cloud, and this goes for any of the cloud file sharing platforms, is they have that traditional shared drive at the moment, maybe in their corporate environment. So they maybe have I love to call it the Z drive, but maybe they've got the Z drive or the P drive or whatever drive it is that you go into that and you've got 60 different folders, and there's huge amounts of data, and different folders are restricted to different people. that particular model doesn't always scale well when you take it to the cloud. So actually, you're better to start to think about, well, actually, which bits of this data are needed by which people, and let's break those out into kind of maybe individual shared areas or individual Dropbox shares or individual Google Drive areas. So rather than just lifting and shifting and trying to replicate the old traditional way, maybe thinking about how people need to collaborate and what they need to do is a really useful way to approach this as a project. Then thinking about the types of documents, because again, this is really key. You know, there's not a one size fits all solution. And again, prime example, and again, I'm going to lean back on SharePoint, but SharePoint is really not great for companies where, for example, they are doing CAD, so construction and architecture and building, builders and building maintenance, and those kind of companies often struggle with SharePoint because CAD documents as a particular type of file are very big. They normally have multiple people that need to work on them. And it just doesn't do a very good job with synchronizing those. So people have them on their machines and they end up running into problems. So there are other file sharing tools. I mean, the one in that instance, there's a tool called Ignite, and Ignite is absolutely like the market leader within that particular industry, in that particular space in terms of construction and building, oil and gas, those kind of things where they work with big data, because it synchronizes so much better than all the competitors that are on the market, including Dropbox and all those other tools. So it's really important to think about the types of documents that you have and make sure that you're evaluating all the tools available. Because again, if you are already paying for Microsoft 365, it's quite easy to go, well, we'll plump for SharePoint because essentially we're paying for it and we're kind of getting it free. We're kind of getting that bundled in with what we're paying for. And it may not always be the right solution. So it's really important to think about the documents that you've got. It's worth thinking about whether you need to do kind of document workflows, because again, SharePoint let you do that, putting your documents into Dropbox. Less so. There are some basic, some background workflow things you can do, but less powerful. Way off topic of this conversation, but there's things like Power Automate within the Microsoft stack that can create lots of clever automations around documents. And again, to be able to really utilize that, you need your documents in the Microsoft environments. They need to be in SharePoint or OneDrive. But if you're not thinking you're going to use that, that doesn't matter. So it's really important to think about kind of that workflow. How do you want documents to move around? What do you want to do with them? And I'll say then really the functionality is the file sharing. So it's there are various different products out there. Some of them will have a bunch of features that you might find really useful. Some of them might have a bunch of features you really don't need. So, if you're unlikely to ever need to share out lots of different subfolders to people, then maybe you don't need a tool that can generate, one-time disposable links so that you can send documents to people. If you do need to do that, if you want to send something out to someone one time and, after that it's the equivalent that catches fire and they never have the link again, you need to think about a file sharing tool that supports that particular facility or a way to do that. So you need to really just sit and think about, what have we got? Who needs to access this stuff? How do we need it to be accessed? And what do we want to do with that data in the future? Start to map all this stuff out and think about that, because then when you are going to talk to, your IT team or your head of IT or an external partner, you can go to them with kind of a really key list of like, here's our crucial stuff. Here's what here's what the system has to do for us. These are our kind of red lines. These are bits here that we'd like to have. These are our niceties, but these are our red lines of things that it must do. Then you need to think about, again, the current IT infrastructure. This is pretty important, actually. And again, this may not appreciate for people on the webinar, this may not be your role and this may not be your thing, but it needs to be thought about and it needs to be discussed with the right stakeholders. Is actually assessing, well, we've currently got file server in-house. Maybe that works really well for certain things. Maybe actually we don't need to take everything to the cloud. Maybe we need that file server there because certain things need to be able to communicate with it. So, for example, there are some products and tools that are traditional kind of desktop applications. Sage is a prime example. That's never really been a particularly good cloud product. That really needs local data and it needs a local server. So there are ways around it, but essentially it might be that the file server needs to be there for that. So maybe you go, well, we keep some data here on the file server, but we move these pieces into the cloud and this is what we collaborate on. So it's not always a lift and shift. It's not always one size fits all. Again, considering all of the things that plug in together to this in the bigger picture will really help to guide the decision there. Then compatibility with software and hardware. So again, Sage is a good case in point. If you were running Sage accounts, for example, unless it's changed, and I don't think it has, it requires something called a data service. So that is another program that has to run, and that actually has to run on the machine that's hosting the Sage data. So what that means in a nutshell is, if, say, for example, if you just had some network storage and it wasn't a kind of a Windows PC or a Windows server, you actually can't host the stage data there because it won't work. So there's lots of little things you need to think about as to like, right, what kind of almost go through an audit and think, right, what have we got on our file server? What do we need? What do we want to move to the cloud? What stuff has to stay? And in most cases, many cases anyway, it is the case that everything can move. Is that the best approach? Personally, I prefer a more considered approach, and my normal methodology around this would be to sort of think of either what stuff do we move that we need to collaborate on immediately, or potentially putting kind of a stake in the ground on a particular date. It might be your year end, it might be a particular start of a month, and say from this point forward, anything new we put in the cloud system, all of our old stuff's on the old server. As we need things, we'll move them in, and over time, we'll get away from the original kind of server that we've got and sort of phase that migration and make it easy for the users. Um, so I've kind of started to talk about steps of implementation, but here we go. So that planning and preparation, yeah, detailed planning is really key. So we've kind of, I think we've touched on that pretty well in terms of thinking about all of the kind of things that need to happen. It's a bigger, it's a much bigger project than it always feels like. So it really is about thinking about, document access, the stakeholders, the key people that need to get hold of things. The more time you spend planning this, the easier it is to get it right. The challenge once you move stuff and you're into the cloud, people start working on it and they start authoring documents in a particular location. You don't really want to have to move them again. So you really want to try and get this right first time. Um, resource allocation. So again, in a nutshell, what that really means, and it's not a very clear term, but resource allocation really is thinking, right, look, how much data have we got on the file server? If we've got 2 TB of data in the file server, we need to buy potentially 2 TB of data in the cloud if we're moving everything. So just understanding what that looks like and what that costs. Because again, with SharePoint, you're going to get a certain amount of data in there, but you're going to have to pay for the overages. So what looks like a free solution on the surface, if you're paying for Microsoft 365, might suddenly get very expensive if you're talking about bringing in 5 or 6 TB worth of data. So yeah, looking at the resources is really key. And then say setting those specific goals, understanding what do we want to achieve out of this project, because this is impactful from a user point of view. Whichever, if you're moving the way that people get hold of their data, it's got a user impact. I got told off for saying no one likes change, because actually I do like change, and there's quite a few people that do relish change, but there's a lot of people that are more change averse than others. So you have to just be mindful that what do you want to achieve out of this? What are the goals? Communicate this clearly to the team ahead of time and really make that plan in advance. Get your IT team involved. So again, whether that's an in-house team, whether that's an external team, whether that's you as a person that is responsible for the IT, this might be completely your remit, but looping IT in early in the process is great. One of the challenges we see as a third party, and certainly where we either come into companies or we have some clients that we kind of co-manage where they have their own IT team and we do some work for them, is challenge around data creep. So where you've got end users that, one of them's gone, oh, well, I've got a personal Dropbox, so I've put some stuff in there, and somebody else has put some bits in their OneDrive, and somebody else has put some bits in SharePoint, and you've got data all over the place. It becomes a real nightmare. So getting IT on side early help with that, so to help identify where that data is. Get the technical support set up and get the plan around that so you know what you're going to do. So once you move this data, well, who's going to support it? Who's going to help the users out with access challenges? Who does the user contact when suddenly they can't find the document that they had before the migration? All that kind of stuff. Just getting that all teed up ahead of time is going to make it much smoother for you. And then also the IT team can obviously implement business needs customization. So if you do need metadata workflows, if you need something a bit more complicated than just your bog standard file share, then again, IT can help with that. And the sooner you do that, the earlier in the process, the better. And they need to be able to, they're going to need to be involved at some point because they're going to have to plan this migration and do it. So looping them in early, helping them understand what you want to do is going to really help that process. And then, yeah, we talked about the change. So training and change management, I think probably the piece that sometimes gets overlooked is, making sure users have comprehensive training is absolutely essential to make sure that the system is successfully adopted. So understanding what's going to happen, communicating that to the users, encouraging them to use the system. So actually, kind of if it's all your files and folders, you haven't got a lot of choice. You kind of got to use it, but actually, maybe you want to encourage some of the collaboration features, or you want to encourage more use of workflows and that kind of stuff. So getting the users on board, and again, looping in IT to help with this is a really, really key thing. I think one of the real key pieces actually, and I've seen this get missed and overlooked a few times, is thinking about what happens on, let's say you are going to do that kind of move everything and you've got a hard cutoff point. Well, the challenge you've got, for example, any of you that use Word or Excel or Google Docs or any of those kind of programs, they all all those kind of programs point to all your most recent files. So when you're taking that SharePoint example again, if you're going to move all your data from a file server and it's suddenly going to go to a completely different place, every user who has recently access to documents showing in Word or Excel, they're going to point to the wrong place. They're going to point to the old location. So first off, you need to think about, well, how do we make sure that they don't make changes in the old location? Because that's the worst thing that happens is suddenly you've got stuff in the new location, stuff in the old location, and people are working on the wrong documents. So we need to cut access off to that. We need to make it read-only. But also, how do we help the user through that process of understanding where their data is now moved to? Because it's a confusing change. And again, if it's something like SharePoint, then that presents in a different way. So if they've been used to having a Z drive down the side of on their kind of My Computer or computer, and as we are now in Windows, they won't have that anymore. It's actually going to be dropped under a name of the company, and they'll have all the different libraries that they've got shared. So it's a different approach to finding things. Now it's only a click different, but it's still a difference. And for some people, that's a real big change. And it's the fear of uncertainty. So communicating that and helping the users understand what's going to happen is really key. So some of the common challenges that we see around these kind of processes, big one actually is user resistance. So certainly when we're talking about systems where the synchronization is different, so where they're going from having like that traditional network drive, like a P drive or a Z drive, and they're going to a different kind of structure or potentially even a different, they're going from one big file share to maybe having lots of different areas for things. There can be a lot of resistance from users around that because it's, again, it's a change and they don't necessarily want to, they don't really understand why they have to. So that's a challenge that definitely needs to be addressed. And I think we touched on that training piece there. I think that's a key thing around the adoption. Data security, this is really key. I mean, once this data goes into the cloud, you need to make sure it is well secured. Again, this is really an IT piece to make sure this is right. But, there are lots and lots of settings that can be configured in these tools. So for example, as standard, most of the platforms will allow you to take a folder, right click it, and share a link out to somebody else because you want to be able to collaborate and you want to be able to share documents, which is great, unless your corporate policy says that you're not allowed to share your data with third parties and guests, in which case the tool needs to be configured to block that or potentially to block it in certain cases. So understanding the data security concerns and again, working that into the plan is really key. And then we often again see challenges around things like integration. So where we're looking at, again, SharePoint is a prime example from the synchronization point of view, or Dropbox, where you have a tool that you would typically run on the PC that will synchronize the files. If you've got lots of users, how do we integrate that? How do we make sure that that's rolled out to all the machines ahead of time, that it's set up ready to go, that everything's good to go? This is not terribly complicated when there's 1 of you, 2 of you, 5 of you, 10 of you. If there's 150 of you, it becomes much more of a challenge. So there's a lot of things to think about in terms of how you make sure this all just integrates and just works, because the worst thing you want to do is kick off this big, we call it digital transformation. We're going to kick off this huge digital transformation project, and it's going to fall flat on its face because nothing's working and the users can't find anything, and they're bombarding IT with problems. It's really not what you want. Certainly not what we want as an IT team. So it's really key to kind of think these things through and really just go in with a real solid plan and spend the time in the planning. Finally, a few tips. Again, for these are sort of SharePoint specific, because as I said before, this is the thing that I know. When you're thinking about SharePoint, there are what are called document libraries. Document libraries are essentially like the drive. So they are the letter or the area that stores a bundle of documents. It's typically 90% of the time, it's not the best idea to put everything in one document library. It's normally better to have multiple document libraries broken out for, say, different types of teams or different groups of people on job function or on role, to make sure you haven't got too many things in one place, but also that you have security in place that differs across the libraries. So organization of the document libraries is key. Utilizing workflows, again, slightly outside the scope of what we're talking about, but there are lots of workflow capabilities in SharePoint. So it's actually, if you're going to go down a SharePoint route, you might want to have to think about document workflows. Now, workflow could be something as simple as saying, when I put a document in this folder, it also then needs to be shared with somebody else. Or it could be something as complicated as saying, I've got a form, I fill some things in, the document goes into SharePoint, and then actually it passes over to another team to fill in other information. You can start to move documents around much more like document management. So you can do some pretty cool stuff in the background. You just need to understand and think about what you might want to do, and then consult with your team about how you would do that. and then actually regular ongoing system evaluation and usage. So regardless, I think, of whether you're on SharePoint, Dropbox, Box, whatever platform it might be, it's certainly a good practice to do a fairly regular review of permissions. So I'd say at minimum 6 monthly, it would be worth running kind of an audit report and understanding who's got what, because when you make things easier to collaborate and easier to move and share, it's a lot easier for the scope to creep, and you suddenly start to find that, person X shared this folder with somebody and we don't actually want them to have that access anymore. So keeping a review and an evaluation on that is a really good idea. Likewise, again, making sure, for example, that you've closed off. If you have a lever, sounds really simple. Make sure you lock the levers out, because you're on another platform. Especially if it's something like Dropbox, where it isn't linked specifically to their email. If it's in something like 365, you're probably going to disable their mailbox, which lock them out of SharePoint. But if they're in Dropbox, you need to remember that you need to go and log into Dropbox if you've got someone that's leaving and disable their access, because otherwise they have access to that and potentially destroy any links that they might have shared externally. And then just auditing who's accessing data. So actually understanding, well, who is looking at my data? Has someone gone and downloaded everything? That could be a challenge. So again, there's rules, alerts that you can trigger around things like a user downloading an abnormal amount of data to their machine, and that might be something you want to set up to understand. Are we facing a data loss issue here, where we have let's say, malicious leaver who's come along and they're downloading all the sales data from the company, and they're going to take that away with them. So things like that, triggering certain things around things like data loss, all things you can think about, and they can all become part of this system evaluation. So that kind of wraps towards the end. I think that's not bad time, actually, just past 30 minutes. That's brilliant. Didn't go on for too long. I'm not sure as yet if I stop screen share, if there are any questions. So please do chuck them in the chat box, and I'm happy to cover them now with Sarah. If not, I will just encourage you to connect with me on LinkedIn. You'll find me if you search for Craig Atkins. You can see my mug there. I'm sure you'll find me on LinkedIn. Or you can get in touch with us directly on our website at onefix.com.
Thank you, Craig. Once again, a packed half an hour of information.
Try and cram it in, Sarah.
I love it. I love it. But you're always so good at really describing it really well that people, I can understand it. So I think if I can understand it, you're okay. And we use SharePoint here at work, and sometimes I get myself in a little bit of a pickle with it. But there's a couple of things that you touched on there that I thought, aha, right, okay, I know that. So that was brilliant. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
No questions have come in as yet.
I got off lightly.
You got off lightly. That just means you did everything perfectly.
Well.
No one needs to clarify anything.
I like that.
But we have recorded this and we'll be downloading this afternoon, popping in our webinar library. So if you wanted to recap, we can do that. We'll get that out. But just remains me to say, Craig, thank you very much once again. Good to see you.
Thank you again. Good to see you again.
Absolutely.
Might see you one more time, I think. Is there one more?
Yeah, there is one more. We're
on
the end of July, the 24th of July. So yes, we're up for that one. So that'll be another one in the CityFibre Digital Academy. So yeah, we'll be back then. I'll see you all then. But thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everybody.
Thank you. Enjoy. Thanks. Thanks all. Bye.